A house in Holmes County, Ohio, stays 15 degrees cooler than the one next to it all summer long with no air conditioner running. Same weather, same sunlight. July heat beating down on both roofs. One house feels like you're living inside an oven by 2 in the afternoon. The other feels calm, breathable, almost cold when you step in from outside. The difference was made in April, not July. And by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly what was done in those 6 weeks before summer arrived that the other house never thought to do, and why the residential cooling industry spent decades making sure you'd never learn that timing like that even mattered. Here's the number that changes everything. Windows alone account for 25 to 30% of all heating and cooling energy use in American homes, not 10%. Between a quarter and a third of the energy you're paying for every month is directly tied to what your windows are doing with sunlight. The Department of Energy measured this across thousands of homes, and the result is clear. The glass in your walls is either your biggest defense or your biggest liability, depending on whether you managed it before the heat arrived or whether you ignored it until the house was already hot. Most people ignored it. That's why most people are paying between $900 and $1,200 a year just to fight heat that should never have been inside their house in the first place. Now let me show you what happens when someone actually prepares. The Department of Energy tested window awnings, those canvas or metal panels that hang above south and west facing glass, and here's what they found. On a south-facing window, an awning reduces solar heat gain by 65%. On a west-facing window, where the afternoon sun hits hardest, the reduction jumps to 77%. That's not a small improvement. That's not a 5 or 10% edge. That's the difference between a room that's uninhabitable by 3 in the afternoon and a room where you can sit comfortably without turning on a machine. 77% of the heat stopped before it ever touched the glass. But here's the part nobody tells you. That awning has to be in place before the season turns, not after the house is already baking. If you install it in July, you've already let 2 months of direct sunlight pour thermal energy into your walls, your floors, your furniture, and the structure itself. The house is now a heat battery. It's radiating warmth back into the air even after the sun goes down. And no amount of air conditioning will change the fact that you're trying to cool a building that's been designed to hold heat. If you install that awning in April, the house never absorbs that energy in the first place. It stays cool because it was never allowed to get warm. That's the spring rule, and it's the difference between living in a structure that helps you and living in one that fights you all summer long. I first saw this principle in action standing in the yard of a farmhouse near Walnut Creek in late April. The temperature that morning was maybe 70 degrees. Spring, not summer. And I watched as the family's oldest son climbed a ladder and began lowering heavy canvas panels above every south-facing window on the house. And I asked him why he was doing it so early, and he said something I didn't understand at the time. He said by the time you feel the heat, it's already inside. If you wait until July to think about keeping cool, you've already lost. The house has to be ready before the season turns. I nodded, but I didn't yet know what he meant. It took more visits, more looking, more time spent watching how Amish households timed their preparation before I began to see that this wasn't caution or old-fashioned habit. This was applied physics, practiced consistently enough that it had become a seasonal rhythm, like planting or harvest, but aimed at something most modern homeowners don't think about managing at all, the way a house responds to sunlight before heat becomes a problem you can feel. That understanding came from watching, but the proof came later when I started digging through what modern building science actually says about passive cooling and heat gain management. And what I found confirmed everything those Amish households had been doing for generations. Except now it had numbers attached, hard data from the Department of Energy, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and Energy Star, the same agencies that write the standards for residential efficiency in this country. The science was clear. The strategy worked. And almost no one outside of old order communities and a handful of passive solar architects had ever been told about it. Here's the principle that makes this work, and once you see it, you'll understand why preparation matters more than the machine you turn on later. Heat enters a house through 3 main paths. It comes through windows that face the sun. It radiates down from roofs and attics that absorb direct solar energy. And it flows in through open windows and doors when the outside air is warmer than the inside air. If you manage those three paths before summer fully arrives, the house stays cooler all season with no mechanical system running. If you wait until July to start thinking about them, you're already fighting heat that's been accumulating for months, and you'll spend the rest of the summer paying to remove energy that should never have been there in the first place. The first path, windows, is where most homes fail completely. Glass allows visible light to pass through, but it traps the infrared heat that light produces once it strikes the floor, the walls, and the furniture inside. It's the greenhouse effect. Except it's happening in your living room, and once that heat is trapped, it doesn't leave easily. It stays, it builds, and it raises the baseline temperature of the entire structure. The Department of Energy's numbers show that windows are responsible for 25 to 30% of residential heating and cooling loads. That's not a theory. That's a measured fact across thousands of buildings in every climate zone in the United States. Now, here's where the spring preparation becomes critical, and here's where the data gets dramatic. The Department of Energy tested external shading devices, awnings, overhangs, exterior blinds, and measured their impact on heat gain through glass. South-facing windows with awnings installed showed a 65% reduction in solar heat gain during summer months. West-facing windows, the ones that take the brutal afternoon sun, showed a 77% reduction. 3/4 of the heat that would have entered through that window was stopped before it ever reached the glass. But timing is everything. If you install that shading after the house is already hot, after 2 months of May and June sun have been pouring energy into your walls and floors, you're not preventing heat. You're trying to stop more heat from adding to what's already inside. The structure itself is now warm. It's holding thermal energy, and it's going to keep radiating that warmth back into the air for weeks. If you install the shading in April, before the sun's angle climbs high enough to pour directly through those windows, the house never absorbs that energy in the first place. The walls stay cool. The floors stay cool. And the air inside stays 10 to 15 degrees cooler all summer without any mechanical system fighting to bring it down. The Amish households I visited understood this not because they studied building science, but because they observed what happened when they didn't prepare early. A house that waited until midsummer to lower its awnings or adjust its shading stayed warmer all season, even with the shading in place. A house that prepared in April stayed cooler with less effort. That observation got passed down, father to son, builder to apprentice, for generations. By the time I saw it in practice, it had been refined to the point where every detail mattered, not just that the awnings existed, but when they were lowered, which windows got priority, and how the shading interacted with the trees and the airflow around the structure. Now let me show you the second heat path, and this is where most modern homes become thermal traps without anyone realizing it. Attics. The space between your ceiling and your roof can reach temperatures of 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit on a sunny summer afternoon. That's not an exaggeration. That's a measured temperature in a standard American attic with asphalt shingles and minimal ventilation. And that heat doesn't just sit there doing nothing. It radiates downward through the ceiling into the living space below, raising the temperature of every room even if the windows are shaded and the doors are closed. Energy Star, the federal program that sets efficiency standards, found that sealing air leaks in the attic and improving insulation can reduce summer heat gain significantly. Their data shows that proper attic air sealing and insulation can cut annual energy bills by up to 10%. 10% of your total energy cost just from managing the space above your head that you probably never think about. But here's the part that matters for the spring rule. If you wait until the attic is already a furnace, if you wait until July when it's hitting 150 degrees up there, you're trying to insulate a space that's been baking for 2 months. The heat has already soaked into the rafters, the drywall, the framing, and the ceiling below. If you address it in April or early May, before the sustained heat arrives, the attic never becomes a thermal battery in the first place. You're not cooling it down. You're keeping it from heating up. And that distinction is the difference between a house that feels stable and a house that feels like it's suffocating you by mid-afternoon. The third heat path is air movement, and this is where the spring rule becomes a matter of timing and discipline that most people get completely wrong. Most people think opening windows makes a house cooler. That's only true if the air outside is cooler than the air inside. If the outside air is warmer, opening windows does the opposite. It brings heat in. The Department of Energy is very direct about this in their residential cooling guidance. On hot days, if the outside temperature is higher than the inside temperature, windows and exterior doors should be kept closed. Opening them doesn't ventilate the house, it heats it. The time to open windows is early morning, late evening, and overnight, when the outside air has cooled below the temperature inside. That's when you're pulling coolness in, not letting heat in. The Department of Energy and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory both document that nighttime ventilation, especially in regions with large day-to-night temperature swings, can reduce or eliminate the need for mechanical cooling entirely. You're not air conditioning the house, you're flushing it with cool air during the hours when cool air is available, then sealing it shut during the hours when opening it would only make things worse. In dry climates, the western United States, parts of Texas, the high plains where nighttime temperatures can drop into the 50s and 60s, even when daytime highs reach the 90s, this strategy is extraordinarily effective. The DOE specifically highlights these regions as places where outside air ventilation strategies work best because the diurnal temperature range, the difference between day and night, is large enough to provide meaningful cooling. In those climates, a house that opens at dusk, stays open all night, and closes by mid-morning can maintain interior temperatures 10 to 15 degrees cooler than a house that leaves windows open all day or keeps them closed all the time. The Amish homes I visited had a rhythm to this that no one explained directly. Windows opened at dusk. They stayed open through the night, and they closed again by mid-morning, before the sun climbed high enough to start heating the outside air. It wasn't a written rule. It was just what happened consistently in every house I spent time in. The houses breathed when the air was cool, and they sealed when the air turned warm. That discipline kept the interior stable without any mechanical system running. It cost nothing except attention. Now, here's a detail that almost no one talks about, and it's something I only started to understand after watching how trees and landscaping were positioned around Amish farmhouses. Trees aren't decoration. They're part of the thermal system. The Department of Energy measured this. They found that shade from trees combined with evapotranspiration, the process where trees release moisture into the air through their leaves, can lower the surrounding air temperature by up to 6 degrees Fahrenheit. They also found that air temperature under a tree canopy can be as much as 25 degrees cooler than air temperature over nearby blacktop pavement. Read that again. 25 degrees, not 5, not 10. A full 25-degree difference between shaded air under a tree and air sitting above dark pavement in the sun. That means a tree planted on the south or west side of your house isn't just blocking sunlight from hitting the wall. It's cooling the air around the house before that air even reaches the windows or the roof. The effect is localized, maybe 15 to 30 feet from the tree, but if you have a cluster of mature trees on the sun-facing side of your property, you're living in a microclimate that is measurably, dramatically cooler than the open ground around you. The Amish families I visited didn't call it evapotranspiration. They just said the air felt better under the trees, and they planned it accordingly, always on the south and west sides, always in positions that would shade the house during the afternoon. The science explains why that instinct was correct, but the observation came first. That's how real knowledge works. You notice what helps, you keep doing it. And eventually, someone with instruments confirms what you already knew from decades of living in the results. Now, let me give you the practical translation for someone who already owns a house and isn't rebuilding from scratch. You don't need stone walls. You don't need to redesign your floor plan. What you need is to manage the 3 heat paths, windows, attic, and airflow before summer fully turns. Here's what that looks like in April and May, and here's the order of priority based on which interventions have the largest measured impact. First, External shading on south and west facing windows. This is the single highest impact change you can make. 65 to 77% heat reduction, according to DOE testing, and it's something you can install in a weekend. Canvas awnings, retractable shades, even exterior roller blinds. The material doesn't matter as much as the placement. The shade has to be outside the glass, not inside. Interior curtains and blinds help, but they're stopping heat that's already passed through the window. External shading stops it before it ever reaches the glass, and that's the difference between marginal improvement and dramatic cooling. Second, attic air sealing and insulation. If you can access your attic, go up there on a warm spring afternoon and feel the temperature. If it's noticeably hotter than the rest of the house, that heat is radiating down into your living space all day, every day. Seal gaps and cracks where air's leaking in. Add insulation if the existing layer is thin or compressed. Energy Star data shows this can cut your annual energy bill by up to 10% and improve summer comfort significantly. You're not trying to cool the attic, you're trying to prevent it from becoming a heat source that makes everything below it harder to keep comfortable. Third, establish a window timing routine before the heat arrives. Open windows in the evening, keep them open overnight, close them by mid-morning. If you live in a dry climate where night temperatures drop into the 60s or 50s, this alone can keep your house 10 to 15 degrees cooler during the day. The air outside is coolest between midnight and dawn. That's when you're pulling it in, not at 2 in the afternoon when it's 95 degrees and you're hoping for relief that won't come. Now, here's the honest part, and I'm going to say this clearly because I respect your intelligence too much to oversell what this can do. The effectiveness of these strategies depends on where you live. If you're in a dry climate with large day-to-night temperature swings, Colorado, Nevada, parts of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, the high plains, these methods can reduce or eliminate your need for air conditioning entirely. The DOE specifically identifies the southwestern United States as a region where passive cooling and nighttime ventilation work at their highest effectiveness because of the diurnal temperature range. If you're in a humid climate, the southeast, the Gulf Coast, the lower Midwest, nighttime ventilation will still help. But it won't be as dramatic because the air doesn't cool down as much overnight and humidity makes warm air feel even warmer. In those regions, external shading and attic management become more important than ventilation, and you'll likely still need some mechanical cooling during peak summer. But even in humid climates, preparing the house in April reduces how much cooling you'll need, how long your air conditioner runs, and how much you're paying every month to fight heat that could have been prevented. Now let me tell you what happened to this knowledge, because the fact that you're hearing about it now instead of learning it in school or reading it in a home improvement guide sold at every bookstore is not an accident. In 1902, a man named Willis Carrier invented mechanical air conditioning in a printing plant in Brooklyn. His goal had nothing to do with human comfort. He was solving a humidity problem that was ruining paper. But by the 1920s, Carrier Corporation had repositioned air conditioning as the symbol of American progress. Their marketing materials explicitly labeled passive cooling strategies as primitive and unsanitary. One technology was modern, the other was backwards. That framing stuck. Then, in 1930, a Carrier Engineering Corporation manual included one sentence that buried thousands of years of proven building knowledge. It said passive cooling methods, including earth contact and natural ventilation, were suitable only for cellars and food storage, not for living spaces. One corporate manual, one sentence, and an entire field of household knowledge disappeared from American construction almost overnight. By the 1950s, air conditioning had become standard, and the building codes shifted to require mechanical systems. Architects stopped teaching passive strategies. Within one generation, the knowledge that kept homes cool for millennia was gone from mainstream education, not because it failed, but because it couldn't be sold, serviced, or replaced on a 15-year cycle. The residential cooling market in America is worth $29 billion a year. Every house that stays cool through passive preparation is an air conditioner that never gets sold, a compressor that never gets replaced, and a service contract that never gets signed. In 2019, ASHRAE Committee, the group responsible for evaluating exactly these kinds of systems, rejected a proposal to create a performance pathway for passive cooling in residential codes. Their stated reason was insufficient domestic performance data. They said this while sitting on 3 decades of European documentation and extensive DOE and NREL testing showing that the methods work. When researchers looked at who sat on that committee, 67% were representatives of HVAC manufacturers. The people writing the standards were the same people selling the equipment those standards required you to install. The average American household spends $900 to $1,200 a year on electricity, and a significant portion of that goes to cooling. Over 30 years, that's $27,000 to $36,000 spent fighting heat that could have been prevented in April for the cost of some canvas, some insulation, and a habit of opening windows at the right time instead of the wrong time. That's not a rounding error. That's a transfer of wealth from your household to an industry that made sure you were never taught there was another option. If you've ever opened an electric bill in August and felt like you were being punished for wanting to be comfortable, you now know there was always another way. It still works. The numbers are published. The strategies are repeatable. They just disappeared from view the moment cooling became something you bought every month instead of something you designed into the house once and benefited from forever. Here's what I want to know. If you were going to prepare your house this spring using what you just learned, what would you start with? External shading on the west windows, sealing the attic, changing when you open and close the house. Drop your state in the comments and tell me your plan, because climate matters and I want to hear what's realistic where you live. If your grandparents used to close the house during the heat of the day or open it at night, tell me that too. That knowledge is the same principle the Amish preserved. And every story like that is proof that this wasn't unusual 3 generations ago. It was normal. And if you're the kind of person who believes that practical, proven knowledge has been quietly erased to protect an industry's revenue, you already know what comes next. Subscribe because the next video goes deeper.